I'm delighted to welcome our first panel of today, looking at the topic of smart cities, smart living. I'd like to welcome to the stage Atim Batra, Associate of Q Venture Partners, Mike Mastroiannis, Founder and Managing Partner of 10x2, and Leo from Smart Cities Consortium. This will be moderated by my esteemed colleague Leo Stemp. Welcome.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone, and welcome panelists we're going to be talking about smart cities this morning. We've got a fantastic panel of experts here for you to take you through this topic. To start things off, I think it'd be interesting to discuss what exactly is a smart city. What makes a city smart? What makes a city not smart? Leo,
yes,
from the Smart City Consortium.
Right.
Tell us, first of all, a little bit about the Smart City Consortium, briefly, but then also, what makes a smart city?
Okay. I'm going to keep it short because we have two experts right next to me. Okay. Okay, Smart City Consortium, we are a non-profit organization in Hong Kong, and our members are coming from different industry in Hong Kong, such as construction, finance, education, healthcare, so on and so forth. So our mission is to make recommendation to the Hong Kong government, from what we see in the industry, and funnel, the message across so that we can help the government to make policy better. Okay, so that's what Smart City Consortium is, all about. And in regard to what exactly is smart city, to sum it up, it's really to make our citizen to have a better quality of life through a series of infrastructure implementation. All right? Simple enough, huh?
Simple enough. But, it covers, as you mentioned, that some of your members, you said there's people in healthcare.
Yes.
There's people in education.
Finance, specifically finance. Yeah,
Finance.
Hong Kong as an international financial hub. We have a lot of members coming from the investment banking industry. Say for me, I'm coming from the venture capital community, and we make investments specifically in the smart city area. Yeah, like the previous speaker, briefly share with all of us, in regard to artificial intelligence and how it's being implemented in the business world. If you look at smart city, it's all about data and smart data utilization and apply it to our daily life.
Absolutely. Mike, 10x2, tell us a little bit about that and your involvement in the sort of smart city movement.
I have working experience in certain sectors of smart city. The smart city is a little bit beyond what I heard before. It's not only these three segments, much more. All the industries are involved in practically. And so I have been involved in communications, in energy efficiency and lighting, working experience. And now 10x2 is a company that is helping startups to scale in scaling stage, not in incubation, in the area of smart city and smart lifestyle. So we have a lot of partners, experts in the area, and we're helping startups to scale.
And what does a smart city mean to you? I mean, what does it cover?
Smart city is about how digitalization, sensors, communication, computing can help to reduce cost, improve efficiency, improve the services in a city. And at the end of the day, the most important is how to improve the quality of life of the citizens. And that's what this smart city for me.
Okay, cool. And Atin, tell us a little bit about Q Venture Partners and your involvement in this space.
A little scared that it's going to come to me in the end. My name is Atin Batra. I'm an associate at Q Venture Partners. Q Venture Partners is a VC fund that invests only in hardware, which is why we have a huge stake in smart cities and smart living. A lot of our portfolio companies are actually in the bucket of enabling technologies, which means that they're sensors, material science, microprocessor chips, semiconductors, so on and so forth, which is sort of in the end the building blocks, the foundational blocks of all other hardware, and therefore used quite extensively in the smart city projects. We do invest directly into smart city projects as well, startups. So as an example that I was sharing with you just a little earlier was we're investing in a sensor company that uses biomaterials to actually measure the concentration of chemicals in the air. And that's something that is very helpful going forward from a smart city perspective. As an example, they're going to be installing that sensor in a number of households to measure methane leaks and to prevent methane leaks. So that's an example of what we're looking at from a smart city perspective. And I think the gentlemen here have already discussed what their definition of smart city is. The only thing that I would add is the way that we think of it is, if there's any way that you can increase the efficiency of a city, whether that's from a transportation perspective or from an infrastructure perspective or from safety, of productivity of the citizens, whatever that may be, we like to lump it all into smart cities because everything's going to be helpful in the long run.
So basically, I mean, all three of you have said that, you know, a smart city basically could be any technology that improves the life of the citizens. And that's the key, putting the citizens, their lives are improved. Is it also, though, about improving the ability of businesses to sell to those citizens and for government to manage that city? Is that the, you know, who's in the driving seat in terms of developing smart cities?
There's no one party in the driving seat. The only way to create smart cities at the end, we need a collaboration between government, private sector, established companies, startups, investors, so everybody. And that's the challenge at this moment with smart city.
I'd like to think that the ultimate end goal is to help the citizens, therefore they should be in the driving seat. Whether they are or not in reality, I guess, is debatable. I do feel that building a smart city just requires a lot of investment. And because of the fact that they need all of that funding, which is also why Leo here mentioned that he's got financial firms in the consortium, but because of the fact that you need all of this funding and investment, you just have to have businesses that sell something to make the money that sort of subsidizes the infrastructure that they're putting up in the first place. I think from a government perspective, and obviously those are the three main stakeholders, as you've already mentioned, the citizens, the private sector, and the government. The government, I guess, obviously has a huge role to play, but I would much rather that they look at it as, is there any way that we can enable the swifter implementation of smart cities rather than what can we get out of it? But then again, I mean, this is more of a utopian view, I think.
This brings, you know, that was a question I was going to ask. You know, who pays for this? Right. Who pays for all these infrastructure upgrades and everything? So far, what's the model?
Just to follow up on the previous question, and on top of that, you know, the follow-up question. So I think it's a very healthy dynamic among three parties. First one, government. Second one is big enterprises. And the third one, entrepreneurs. Why is that? You know, always, you know, new inventions always coming from entrepreneur. Entrepreneur, they build up some kind of sales tractions. And then big enterprises, they realize that. And then they try to either beat them, or they try to ignore them at the very beginning. And eventually, when the trend is formed, they have to follow. And then government would need to set policies around it to make sure that citizens' interest is taken care of. So going back, you know, to the question, I think the driver is really, the original core driver is coming from entrepreneur. In a free society, always coming from entrepreneur who see an opportunity, who see there's a pain point in the industry, in the community. Oh, wow, you know, if I develop something, people will buy. People will use my service, okay? There's a market there. Let's build something around it. And usually that's how it spawns out, okay? So a perfect example would be in the last few years, if people take a look at blockchain technology, that's a perfect example, all originating from entrepreneur. And then they start to get traction. Big enterprises like IBM, all those big guys come in, you know, and then government come in to set policies. And blockchain is a big play in smart city, actually. We look into a lot of different projects in blockchain area.
Mm. Well, I mean, just get into that. I mean, what are the best investable opportunities around the smart city?
I mean, the stuff that we were invested in, as I said earlier, is sensors. In the end, a smart city is all about data, and to collect data, you have to have a physical object, a sensor, some sort of an interface with the physical world that collects all of that data. Or the second aspect would be to enact on whatever data analysis that you've done, and therefore you need hardware, and that's where we are placed. So we love looking at sensors. One of the other interesting aspects that we look a lot in is power. And because sensors in the wide world need to be powered up, they need electricity or just need battery power. And so, for example, we've invested in two specific companies around this. One is a material science company that is actually using, that has developed a material that does thermoelectric generation, therefore uses heat in the environment around it and then generates electricity that sort of powers the sensors. Another example is a battery that we've invested in. This battery, it actually packs in 5 to 10 times more battery power in the same size of a mini battery. And that's basically by changing the anatomy and the structure of the battery. We're looking at all of this and we're saying, okay, this is the foundational blocks. How can we actually sort of plug it into different applications? And a lot of them just happen to be smart cities.
Absolutely. So,
So I believe that at the end, the value is going to be in the platforms, and we see it already happening. So you can talk about sensors, you can talk about hardware, you can talk about systems. At the end, the value is created in platforms because we need to link it to the quality of life. So what is the interaction of people with what the people interact? At the end of the day, the platform is the software, is the data. So that's the answer. Because your question is not easy. Sometimes it depends also for which area of the world you are talking about at this moment, for which timing you are talking about. So, but in general, at the end game is link the customer value and with what the customer interacts. I think there's the value.
Absolutely agree with that. And that actually is another thing that helps build a sustainable business, because in the end, for a startup, you do need recurring revenue, and it's the platform portion of it that actually gives you that revenue, whether that's by selling, I don't like to use the word, by selling the data to other enterprises, to governments, or providing customers the accessibility, and that's where you get the recurring revenue. That's what makes them a more sustainable business. Completely agree with you. Platforms, the way to go.
the sensors you mentioned that pick up sort of pollution and things like that, and what's the business model there?
So the business model is exactly that. It's a platform. So they actually lease the hardware. They don't even sell the hardware. They lease the hardware and they bundle a dashboard monitoring system that you then subscribe to on a monthly basis. And they're actually selling that sort of a sensor to big enterprises, to governments, to consortiums that are helping with maintaining security or other things. And so, yeah, it's a monthly subscription. They don't even sell the hardware. The hardware is not even being bought. There's no cost price to it. It's all about building that platform and a recurring monthly revenue.
I mean, you mentioned this, the business model basically being this data that you can then use and sell possibly to other people. But in a sort of post-Cambridge Analytica world, in a post-GDPR EU world, is that business model sustainable? Can that work?
Yes, and the answer is not the same for Europe or US or China. We need to talk about geography. For China, the answer is 100% yes, because people value more convenience than their privacy. In Europe, GDPR is going to change the game, but at the same time, people want also convenience, so there will be a trade-off. So the business model will continue with some adaptation. And the companies need to adapt to respect more the privacy, but still there will be data and insights. So that's my view.
No, I think GDPR doesn't really stop a business from collecting data or selling it. I think it just makes sure that you don't misuse it and you don't let others get access to it without getting the requisite permissions. And I think that's a good thing because, to be honest, tech companies have been running rogue with all of this data, and they really need to be checked. They need to be told that this is not done. Right?
I'm pro GDPR as well because I think it strikes a very well balance between data abuse, abusing personal data, and full control. Excuse me, abusing personal data, and kind of like having a full access to everybody's data set. Yeah.
But when you look at some of these, I mean, Fabrice's presentation earlier had a thing of people walking down the street, and this machine vision AI vision machine checking your mood state and things like that. Is the growth of the smart city the sort of death of privacy? Are people prepared to put up with that? And you mentioned the convenience, but it has to be very convenient for you to just say, okay, I'm happy for everyone to be looking at how I'm feeling today.
I think there's an opt-in. The beauty of GDPR is you can opt in and opt out. So you're right. The camera may be everywhere. As soon as we walk out of this hotel, even in this hotel, right? Some camera will be watching you, but can they actually use the data for processing? Can they store the data? There's strict regulations around it. All right. So as long as those regulations are in place, we're good. I feel comfortable in front of the camera because I know the law and orders protecting us.
So the issue is for what the data are going to be used. Exactly. That's the story.
I feel like I have, in the long run, I would short this whole conversation just because I think in the long run, we are going to get to that state where everybody's just using cameras in the streets. An example of that is actually if anybody you've watched Black Mirror, and there's this one particular episode where they basically talk about how you can actually control or define a person's value by the number of followers they have on social media, and that I genuinely believe that that's going to happen. Even though I wouldn't want it to happen, whether not to me, not to my family, not to anybody I know, or not to anybody I don't know also, but I think it's going to happen. Whether that's 10 years down the line or 20 years, I don't know.
What's your take on, in China, this social score situation?
Yeah, that's the whole thing, right? That's a perfect example of that actually happening in the real world. People are not pushing back at all. They're absolutely fine with it because they value the convenience of it. However, we from the outside, we feel like, oh, this is some kind of dystopian government view that's happening. And I think both of them are right. I think both those views are correct. It's just how evolved is your thinking. I think 10 years down the line, we'll be okay with it.
You say no one's pushing back on it, but
Not everybody's fine. So let's be honest, right? Sure. But the great majority, they don't care. That's the statement. Right.
yeah, but if you weren't fine with it, what are you supposed to do about it? Because you push back at it, your social score goes down.
Exactly, that's what I mean. It's a system that you can actually do nothing about, to be honest.
But is that a good thing? That's clearly not a good thing, is it?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a good thing. I generally don't think that I'm qualified to make a statement saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I feel like it's going to happen. The way that we can ensure that it doesn't happen tomorrow or day after is by using policies like GDPR. And I feel like the biggest component of this is education, right? Educating the companies that are building all of this, that they need to understand that this is what they're going to this is the effect or the result of what they're building, and maybe there's some way that they can build in fail-safes. But again, my personal opinion is 20 years later, this is going to happen. You can't do anything about it.
Maybe to bring the discussion again back to smart city, I would like to make a statement here. Without shared data, we cannot create smart cities. So we need to find some way to share data between government and public and private sector to create smart city, and this is one of the biggest challenges going forward.
I think the gap is closing. In response to your question about some countries like China, they have a very kind of like a strict, kind of like the Big Brother approach, versus some other places in the world where they really kind of like every single bit of data has a very high barrier, of entry before, someone can use it or, apply it to any business use cases. But I think, it's like a Big Bang theory. At the very beginning, now we have all the big data, AI, technology infrastructure available, to every single one of us. You go to Google, you can pretty much download the latest, AI library, for free, literally, So under that kind of like ecosystem, IT, ecosystem nowadays, I think, we are going through kind of like consolidating stage where countries where they have strict regulations, on supervising every single one, all the way the full spectrum to a free society where everything is respected, every single bit, the government cannot use it unless, the person is giving authorization. to the authority to use it. There will be a balance, and then the whole world, the whole ecosystem is going to consolidate to a certain point where we will find the best balance, among all countries. And then at that point, we will have the concept, like what this very morning we talked about, the EID concept. Once the consolidation happens, every single country has a consensus of what should be used, what should not be used, what is the right opt-in policies. At that point, EID, electronic ID, a full, transparent, efficient KYC, AML logistic protocol will be in place. At that point, I think smart city will run a lot more smoother than the one we are seeing today.
Sorry, I'm just going to butt in, but I completely agree with what Mike said slightly earlier, which is that for smart cities, we need data, and that's really the lifeblood of smart cities. And while we can keep discussing what's going to happen in the future, and we sort of keep concentrating, and I think this is human nature, we keep concentrating on the downsides of this, but we forget what are the upsides of it, right? As an example, a company that we've invested in that does vital signs measurement, contactless, from a distance, they can measure your breathing rate, your heart rate variability, your temperature, and so on and so forth. And an application that they're working on is actually putting that sensor into automobiles. In the future, if you're, for example, in a self-driving vehicle, there's an accident, and the vehicle's overturned, and the government or somebody has to dispatch emergency services, but you don't know whether that person in the car is alive or not. You can use that sensor to actually figure out whether that person's in a state to call for one or not. If he is in a state to call for one and has not called, maybe there isn't a need for one, for an emergency responder. And the other flip side is if you can see that their heart rate is dropping, they're actually in a semi-comatose state. Hope that doesn't happen to anyone, but if that is the case, then the emergency responders know that they need to go out, and that can only be enabled by the fact that that sensor's there and that they're collecting data. Now, when you look at it, that's like the most intimate data that you can have, your breathing rate. But only if you give up that kind of data can you actually have that sort of a situation play out.
When you're upside down in your car, you don't necessarily want to be sort of desperately reaching for the opt-in button.
Exactly.
Suddenly opting in,
Yeah.
We are actually, just speaking along the line, we're actually looking into another company in the ultra-wideband technology. They actually put in the ultra-wideband sensors on all the nursing homes, so that if the elders, fall or, kind of like we can actually measure all the way down to, really, really tiny bit of difference. So even heartbeat, we can tell. So it's being, applied to pretty much people across the life, all walks of life.
Absolutely.
IoT thing, yeah.
Yeah. And, we talked about sort of the transparency. Are there any examples in the world? For example, Estonia is often held up as a good example of this, where, the data is all there. Everyone has an, e-citizenship. You have a number. You can do all sorts of government services. But they have very, very strict rules in place as to how you can use that data. So if a doctor was to go into your medical records and sell that data to an insurance company, they go to prison. And that's sort of what you need, isn't it? But in the world of tech, as we mentioned earlier, I think, it tends to happen that the technology gets developed, gets implemented, and then the regulators kind of catch up, and we go, we got all these problems. So, are the governments around the world, keeping up with these developments and really thinking about how they're going to do this?
Some governments take the lead. Let's take Dubai, for example. They decided in 5 years what they're going to do. And they invited companies to participate in this. So the collaboration, we said public and private. And they are committed to execute. And they are executing. Okay? That's what needs to be done in more cities. Estonia is another example. It took them 10 years to come to the stage they are. And at the end of the day, we should not go back always to the technology. We need to go back, what is the benefit for the citizens? And then the use case has to be reflected to that, not to the technology.
Not the other way around.
It's a competitive world out there. It's not just Hong Kong fighting with the US for talent. It's also Salt Lake City fighting for talent with Seattle or whatever, right? Each cities in themselves are also fighting to be the storehouse of that talent. And to be competitive, the cities, the governments, they will just have to get into this. Like, this is what they have to do. They have to build a smart city. So I think everybody's committed to it. It's just how fast is somebody moving, and what are they, how they're executing, I guess.
I think it's competitive and at the same time cooperative. Like, Smart City Consortium, we actually sign a lot of MOUs, with pretty much all the countries in the world. So the purpose is to collaborate with each other. So like, last week, actually, we invite the CIO, Chief Information Officer from Moscow, to come over to Hong Kong, and give us kind of like an overview of what Moscow is, doing in regard to smart cities. And gee, we learn a lot. They pretty much every single aspect, they have it automated, IoT, you name it, data collection from all spectrum of your daily life. They capture it, and then they apply it accordingly to improve the citizen's life. So after that session, we actually talk a lot about, hey, potential collaborations, like, hey, which vendor you use for facial recognition, which vendor you use for the intelligent lamppost, okay? We do communicate and we exchange notes, and we decide, hey, okay, that vendor is probably the best, for this kind of, countries, with this kind of weather, and then we just say, hey, let's, talk to the vendors together and see if we can collaborate on, some kind of research and development efforts. So I think it's both competitive and cooperative.
And how is Hong Kong performing in terms of developing itself?
Right now, so in regard to smart cities, actually there's a very long laundry list, of criteria we need to check out in order to be fully certified to be smart city. And Hong Kong, right now at this moment, is not yet compared to, let's say, Dubai, or Singapore, or Amsterdam. We are kind of like a little bit lag behind, However, we're working toward, fulfilling all the criteria on the checklist, and get Hong Kong to be, on the officially, on the smart city.
What's Hong Kong missing?
List. Go back to what we talked about, the EID stuff, privacy. We do need to figure out, because Hong Kong is a very, very kind of like a law and order friendly, city. So we do have very strict policy in regard to personal information, but without, a certain degree of disclosure, that kind of like hinder our development in regard to, let's say, implementing some really efficient financial infrastructure. If you take a look at China, for example, if you don't have a WeChat, hook up to your bank account, pretty much you can't do anything in China nowadays. But in order to do that, actually, they have a very, very well-built or super transparent EID, electronic ID infrastructure in place. Can that system be implemented in Hong Kong? Technologically, very easy. But in order to pass the regulation, I don't know when.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Napoleon.
Considering all this technology is coming into cities, do you see people moving out to the countryside to get away from all of the technology? Because, I mean, I'm getting scared. My heartbeat's going to be recorded, what I eat, who I hang out with, which hotel I go to at lunchtime. It's all going to be recorded. Won't I just go, fuck this, I'm going to go and live in the countryside? Is that where the rebels will live, in the countryside?
It's probably going to be what people are going to do if they want to get away from all of the data recording, but where are the jobs, where are the opportunities, what do you do to, if you want to go to a bar, you can't really go to one in the countryside, whatever.
But a drone can fly it to you, can't it?
Sure, and that drone could also be flying to record data in the countryside. So I think it works both ways. I guess in the end, it's what we've been saying again and again. It'll come down to, and by the way, you know this better than any of us do, considering your line of work. But once individuals get comfortable with the idea of sharing data, I think it's not going to matter anymore.
The majority of the people, they will not move out because of the reason you mentioned. They will move out because the whole autonomous entities is going to help the people to live further away from the center. That's my view.
Eventually, it all boils down to quality of life, right? you don't want to go, since the invention of air conditioner, you don't want to go back, to back, 200 years ago. You just feel like, hey, nowadays I walk into this hotel, air conditioned, I just feel cool, right? You don't want to get into a sauna room, and everybody just boil and sweating. Same thing.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we've only had 30 minutes on that, and we could go on for a long time. I was going to say smart cities, a hacker's paradise, was going to be my next question, with all these different stakeholders, devices, platforms, private, public partnerships. But unfortunately, we'll have to leave that question for another time. But thank you very much for a fascinating discussion on smart cities. Thank you.